I developed this presentation that I call the Radical Forest Manager. I'm changing it all the time. It's really fun to do because it expresses a lot of really important ideas, I think, about how we frame our forests and how we manage them. And so without further ado, I will start the presentation. Like Harry said, if you have questions, we'll have time at the end for questions. You can either raise your hand using that hand raising icon at the bottom of on that bar at the bottom of your screen, like Harry's showing. Or you can type into the chat box and we can talk about any part of this that you have questions about at the end.
Yeah, and I will jump in real quick to let people know that we are going to record this. So if anybody wants to come back to it later, we will record it and place it up on our social media and our website as well.
Yeah, and so there's a lot here, and at times I'm going to have to move through it kind of quickly. So if there's ideas or you're wondering what I said or what reference or resource I referred to, that will be posted, and so you'll have a chance to check back with it. So I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. All right. So again, my name's Ethan Tapper. I am the Chittenden County Forester, and I work for the state. I work for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. This is my email address. If you want to know more about any of the stuff that I'm talking about, if you want to schedule a visit to your own piece of forested land, if you want to get on my mailing list, I keep up a mailing list of different events and educational opportunities that I and partners are doing. You can email me at this email address. So what is radical? So the idea of this presentation basically was to engage with a couple different ideas of what radical is. One is this first definition, relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, far-reaching or thorough, very different from the usual or traditional. The word radical comes from the word for root, and so it sort of means grasping something at the root, right? So a fundamental change in the way something is, which I think is the way that we need to think about the way that we want to change how we treat and how we manage our forests. So this is sort of positing a different idea of how we can think about our forests. Relatively recently, compared to that first definition, there is a second definition for the word radical, which is taking on this connotation of political, social justice, advocating or based on thorough or complete political or social change, favoring drastic political, economic, or social reforms. This is another idea that I really want to incorporate into that sort of new vision for forestry that we have. So with everything, and it's becoming increasingly clear with how differently engaged with concepts of especially racial justice right now we are, how do we incorporate that into everything we do? But sort of for the work that I do, especially into the way that we manage our forests and other ecosystems. So these are basically the principles. To start out, what you have to do basically is you have to zoom out in every way, right? To be a radical forest manager, you have to be willing to go from, sort of your life and your narrow vision and experience with these things and the concepts I'm going to talk about, into a broader, both ecological, historical, and social context. You have to be willing to be educated, to put in the work, to be open, informed, to be humble, willing to embrace nuance and potentially overturn some of these strongly held beliefs that you might have, that we all have. It's also important to recognize collective responsibility. So especially in the case of forests, what you'll see is that they affect us all. And our decisions on a forest land affects more than, on a piece of forest land affects more than just one person. In the same way that, our actions in our community affect more than just us, right? They affect, a much broader scope of different people and different aspects of our communities. And this is really, really important, you have to be willing to make tough decisions to do the right thing. So while I consider myself in the way that I think about forests and forest management to sort of be on this progressive end of the spectrum of management, sometimes the actions that I think that are necessary to really protect our forests and to treat them well are not what you might think of when you think of that. And we'll sort of talk about what that is, the steps that it takes to sort of engage with our forests in a healthy way, and to do so in a way that also protects and enhances and enriches our human communities might not be intuitive. So what is a forest? So the first thing that we need to recognize is that our definition, or what most people's definition of what a forest is, may be lacking. So if you go on the internet and you search for what's a forest, this is what comes up. It's a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth. It's a dense growth of trees and shrubs covering a large area. It's a large area full of trees. And so this would lead you to think that a forest is a bunch of trees, right? So if there's a bunch of trees there, it's a forest. But when you dig deeply into the science of how forests work, this definition of a natural community from this amazing book on Vermont, Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, by Thompson and Sorensen, is really a better definition. So it's an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. Trees are not the extent of what a forest is. Trees are a symptom of this incredibly complex system, and they're affected by these huge landscape level processes and also minuscule organisms and minuscule processes. So it's important to recognize that trees are really, really important to forests, but that forests themselves are these much broader systems, and they're actually dynamic systems that are in movement, not just sort of this static community of just trees. So to understand forests in Vermont, you really need to understand some historical context, because our forests are shaped by land use history, perhaps more than any other single factor. So in the 1800s and early 1900s, this is a picture of Heinsberg from the 1800s. Backing up, so prior to European settlement, Vermont was about 95% plus forested. In the 1800s, a bunch of stuff happened. A large part of this was driven by increased presence of humans. So Europeans increasingly settled in Vermont after the late 1700s. And in the early 1800s, due weirdly to the Napoleonic Wars, a bunch of these really awesome sheep that had previously been only pretty much in Spain were allowed to be exported to Vermont. They're what we now know as merino sheep. And the wool was so good and it was so valuable that everybody in Vermont pretty much lost their minds. This guy, William Jarvis, who was the United States consul to Portugal, exported a bunch of these sheep to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. And over the next 30 years, so this is going into the 1830s, about 80% of Vermont was clear cut. A large part of that was for sheep pasture. Some part of that was also exploitation for the railroads and the massive amount of charcoal that they needed, which just made people just cut trees and cut trees and cut trees. The only places that were really not cleared were these sheltered little pockets, really inaccessible areas, high elevation areas, places like that. So almost every place you've ever been was probably clear cut or a pasture at that time. In the 1850s, the wool markets crashed. A lot of Vermont switched to dairying. And throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of our forests started to, or a lot of our, what previously had been forests, then was cleared, reverted back into forests. Most of Vermont's forests are still like 60 to 100 years old. We know that forests influence wildlife, right? So they provide habitat for wildlife. Also, wildlife influence forests. So remembering that forests are systems, a really important part of that system is these animals. Animals do all kinds of different things. They regulate the process of natural forest regeneration. They cycle nutrients. They influence each other's populations and so influence the effect of those populations on plant species. And as you can imagine, the effects of this wholesale land clearing of the 1800s and the increased presence of these European settlers had a massive impact on wildlife. During this time, many of our native species, even some of the species that we have back in our landscape now, were extirpated or went extinct. So this is a picture of the last catamount shot in Vermont, which was shot in 1881 in Barnard. The eastern catamount is now considered extinct as of, I think, 2017 or 2018. There was a bounty placed on wolves, so we extirpated all of our native wolves from the state. We also lost all of our beaver and all of our turkey and all of our bear and all of our white-tailed deer. Caribou and elk were the main ungulates on our landscape at that time. We lost all of our otter and our marten and our fisher as a result of overexploitation and also habitat loss because we cleared everything. This is an example of, in the early 1900s, we did reintroduce some of these species. So beavers were reintroduced, turkeys were reintroduced, deer were reintroduced in the late 1800s, fisher were reintroduced in the middle 1900s, partially to combat this exploding population of porcupines, which for about 50 years in Vermont, there was something called the porcupine bounty, where porcupines are basically, their native predator was the fisher. And in lieu of that predator, porcupines populations exploded, and they were just like eating people's houses and damaging tons of trees. And there was a bounty where you could turn in 2 of their ears and you would be issued the bounty. You had to turn them into the town clerk. And so a lot of people basically harvested porcupines, or, in many cases, over-harvested porcupines to cut off their ears. Sometimes there was some ear counterfeiting. I heard that you could make a pretty convincing pair of ears from a porcupine belly and turning them into the town clerk until fishers reestablished in Vermont in the middle 1900s. So the beaver is a specifically interesting example because it's an example of what we call a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that disproportionately affects its environment and other wildlife species. The beaver does this by basically creating wetlands, right? It dams waterways, and in so doing, it produces all of this amazing habitat for birds and mammals and fish and aquatic organisms and plants. And so losing beaver, you actually lose this incredibly rich abundance of life. And there's increasingly examples about that. There's examples out west where we've seen wolf reintroductions lead to massive ecosystem-wide changes. So the predators themselves in some ways are keystone species because they're influencing herbivores, which influences the herbivory and in turn influences the growth and development of our ecosystems. Beavers now have a population that is stable or growing in Vermont. So the legacy of the 1800s, there are many. In general, if you think of forests as systems, forests prior to European settlement had been developing for hundreds or thousands of years. When they developed certain attributes, which we'll talk about in a second. But our forests, again, are usually, in general, 60 to 100 years old. So they're younger, they're less diverse, and they lack some of these features that are endemic to old-growth forests, like big trees, big old trees, dead wood, high amounts of soil carbon. Our landscapes in general are also pretty sort of monochromatic. They lack this historical balance of young forest and old forest that we would have seen prior to European settlement. Different tree species thrive in a field than would naturally thrive in an old-growth forest. So we see a different species composition of trees, different mix of different tree species, and also these altered wildlife species dynamics. So an example of this is you extirpate all your predators, and a species like white-tailed deer, which we now know to be overpopulated in the state and has major implications for biological diversity in our forests by the way that they browse young trees and plants. You have these sort of spin-off effects of these things as a result of both the composition and the structure of a forest and also the effects on wildlife. In addition to that, what we saw is that as our forests regrew, they were managed essentially poorly. So there is this idea, especially in the early 1900s, this idea of the regulated forest. The regulated forest is the idea that imported from Europe, that we could grow forests if we controlled every single aspect of forest growth and development, that we could grow them way more efficiently than nature could grow them. Baked into this was this idea that if a tree was no longer valuable to us, then it was just a waste of space, right? So these big old trees that we now know have massive ecosystem benefits from their ability to provide habitat for specific species that nest in holes in only larger trees, to their function as hubs in these massive underground fungal networks. They're really, really important, but in the early 1900s and even up through the middle and late 1900s, these trees were called decadent, meaning that they were just sort of wasting space, taking up resources, which could be occupied by younger, faster growing, more economically valuable trees, which are called thrifty. At the same time, people exploited our forests widely. So, going back from the 1600s when Vermont's forests were exploited for what are called mast pines, basically these big trees that would become the masts of ships, there was this idea that forests could sort of respond to anything and remain healthy, and that there would always be more trees. In the 1600s, they thought that they could start logging at the East Coast, and by the time they got to the other side of this continent, that all those trees that they logged initially would have regrown, which of course just isn't true. What happened? So these terms, high grading and diameter limit cutting, high grading is just going into the forest and cutting all the most valuable trees and leaving all the least valuable trees. The problem with that is the most valuable trees are also the healthiest, so you're basically doing reverse selection. You're making your forest intentionally less healthy over time. Diameter limit cutting is where you go in, you'll say, well, I'm only going to cut the trees bigger than 12 inches in diameter or 14 inches in diameter because that's the size that I need to make a saw log to send to the mill. The problem, again, is that those are the trees that are usually healthier, and that's why they're bigger. We also saw poor protection of soils, so logging trails that were unstabilized and caused massive erosion and water quality issues. And in general, these sort of forest management strategies, if you can call them that, were focused on simplifying forests and managing them extractively, and ended up degrading them in many cases, rather than thinking about how to manage this resource for the long term and how to make forests even more healthy and more complex, and how to manage them like forests manage themselves. So I don't know where this comes from, but this is a consistent theme that I see when I walk with people in their woods, is that everybody thinks that a forest that looks like this, so widely spaced trees, nothing growing in the understory, this sort of park-like appearance is what healthy forest looks like. There's something intuitive about it and attractive. Unfortunately, this is a purely human construct. So when old timers take me out to their forests, as they often do, and show me where they've they've maybe mowed in the understory of the forest and they've picked up every stick that's fallen on the ground and every fallen tree and cut down every dead standing tree, what they've done is actually interrupt the natural developmental processes of the forest, not make a forest that's actually healthier. This is what healthy forests really look like. So remember, and I say messy is good. And so remember that forests are these systems. And so in these systems, over time, these systems are actually enriched by death and disturbance, by trees falling over and new trees regenerating. And that's a hard thing for people to understand, especially when we're still in this mindset of being driven by like resource extraction and exploitation. So we're like, oh, a tree falls on the ground. Well, that's a wasted tree. Well, in the forest, dead wood is a really, really important resource. It builds our soils. It's used to feed a massive diversity of different organisms. Wildlife use them for different types of habitat. And in those areas where trees fall over, we regenerate new trees, which provides different habitat. The gaps that are created in the canopies of our forest are amazing places for our insectivorous birds to forage. It's really, really important. And so one of the things that I do often is help to re-educate people about what healthy forests look like, because it's not what's intuitive. It's more this sort of messy appearance of trees of many different sizes and ages, dead wood on the forest floor, dead standing trees, all that stuff, which seems to be intuitively chaotic or messy, but is actually really indicative of a more healthy forest. And I'm really, really into old growth forests. And this is because, and as I'll, I think, say on the next slide, these are forests that have evolved basically independent of extensive disturbance for a long time. It doesn't mean that they're forests that never have trees fall over, that trees never die in. It just means that there hasn't been a widespread windstorm or ice storm or logging or, logging at least in the terms of clear cutting, or, one of these massive, what we call a stand replacing disturbance, in usually we say about 150 years. However, within that 150-year period, what that doesn't mean is that all the trees there are 150 years old. There are some trees that will be older, and there are also trees of all different sizes and ages which have had an opportunity to grow because there have been small-scale disturbances throughout that entire time. Prior to European settlement, we think that about 55 to 60% of New England's forests were in this sort of old growth category, and today it's about 0.4%. Definitely a really interesting way to look at forests is to sort of think about how are these old growth forests growing, and instead of thinking about how can we manage forests in that sort of the regulated forest mindset better than forests can manage themselves, forests are telling us how they want to grow, basically by just showing us in the form of these old growth forests. They're showing us how they manage themselves. They're showing us how they, over the long term, are stable and support this massive, incredibly dynamic network system. And so I look to them for cues on how to manage our forests actively as well. So like I said in the previous slide, old growth forests, we usually define them structurally. So again, it's not like you just go into an area and all the trees are 150 years old and you go, great, it's an old growth forest. Usually you have some big old trees. But you also have trees of all different sizes and ages. We call this structural complexity or structural diversity. And what that just means is that there's trees that are young, trees that are middle-aged, trees that are very old, patches of trees of all of those different sizes and ages. There's a diverse composition, many different species of trees, but usually dominated by more shade-tolerant tree species like American beech, sugar maple, species like that. All throughout this forest, there's big gaps in the canopy, which are filled up with young trees. There's dead wood absolutely everywhere. Deep developed soils. So what happens is that as dead wood falls on the forest floor, it rots, it becomes incorporated into those soils. As trees fall over, they actually mix the soil. So when they create a tip up, bringing their root system out of the ground, they actually mix those soils and create these really deep organic matter rich soils. And what you'll see is that they have this process of continuous development over time. So this process of development never stops. It's not like all the trees all grow and they're all the same age and they grow to a certain age and then they all die. What you'll see is that it's much more heterogeneous than that. So it's these little disturbances all over the place, and the forest as a system, even throughout all this change and this dynamic sort of feel, is continuously developing. And actually what they're doing by doing that is they remain stable over time as a system. So not protecting individual trees, but protecting the health of the system over time. If you go into an old growth forest, there's not that many of them left. There's one forest that has pockets that have sort of an old growth feel in Charlotte, a place called Williams Woods, which is on East Thompsons Point Road and is owned by the Nature Conservancy. And I took a group in there, and we parked on the road and we started walking in through an area that was a field probably 80 years ago, and everybody was like, wow, this is really nice. You know, it looked like everybody wants a forest to look like. And then we got into the old growth, and one of the people on the tour said, oh, I don't like that, because it doesn't look like you'd expect. Again, it looks really messy. Suddenly there was big rotting tree trunks all over the place, and some big trees, but young regeneration. Some areas were too thick to walk through or look through. They're these incredibly dynamic, rich places. Why are old growth forests important? So I really value them, especially because they provide reference. They demonstrate how forests manage themselves. They demonstrate how forests grow, which we don't have a great template for because all of our forests are so young. They also are providing really important habitat conditions, unique habitat conditions, just by merit of being this now underrepresented forest type on our landscape. They provide refugia. And in that, they provide ecosystem services, so unique benefits and services across our landscape that benefits all of us. So ecosystem services are stuff like the way that forests clean our air and clean our water, sequester and store our carbon, provide habitat for our wildlife, stuff like that. And intrinsic value. So they're beautiful, they're impressive, they're important independently of if they do anything for us. And they're just really, really cool. So going back to Vermont's landscape, so again, I said at the top of this that Vermont is about 75% forested, about 80% of those lands are privately owned, as you can see by this pie chart here. That number, so the amount of forested land in Vermont was increasing for a long time, and has now, just over the last 10 years or so, started to decrease. We were up around 80%, now we're decreasing. We're losing, depends on who you ask, we're losing over 2,000 acres of forest land a year. Our rate of development is increasing about twice as fast as our population, which just means that we're not developing our land efficiently. Our average parcel size is decreasing, and our number of landowners is increasing, again, which just means that we're fragmenting our landscape, splitting these chunks of forest land up into smaller and smaller pieces, which has major implications for its health. Again, like I talked about with ecosystem services, it's important to acknowledge that Vermont's forests are sort of engaged in this really cool experiment, right? What happens when all of the forest land that's providing us all with literally the means to live, air, water, stuff like that, are concentrated mostly into the land, into private hands. So I often say that if you're a private landowner, you're still producing public benefits for all of us. And so we all sort of should have a stake or an interest in what's going on in private lands, because that's what's providing us with everything from the water that we drink to the experience of living in Vermont, where it's beautiful, right? These green mountains covered in forests. Most of those forests are not publicly owned. They're owned by people. And so that's a really, really important thing to think about. And then another part of sort of this idea of the radical forest manager is, let's expand ourselves and our way of thinking and what we've, sort of taking into the way that we want to manage our forests, a broader global perspective. So globally, we have rapid global forest cover loss. We are experiencing a mass loss of global diversity. The U.S. is a huge cause of this. We're less than 5% of the global population, but we consume a third of the resources. And that resource consumption globally is increasing, not decreasing. And to consider that climate change, resource extraction, resource consumption disproportionately affects poorer and more vulnerable communities and communities of color. So the impacts of that consumption is not equally distributed. It's important to think about this concept of a mass extinction. Most conservation biologists believe that we're in the midst of what we consider to be the sixth mass extinction, and this period that we call the Anthropocene, which is a geologic era in which humans are the dominant influence on climate and ecology. And we're in the middle of this massive constriction of global biodiversity that's been developing over thousands, millions of years. Globally, animal populations are 50% of what they were in 1970. That doesn't mean that 50% of all the animals are extinct. It means that there's literally 50% of the number of animals that there were in 1970 on the planet. And we have an extinction rate that's 10 to 10,000 times, depending on who you ask, 100,000 times the background extinction rate, which means that the rate at which species naturally go extinct. And this is a really important thing. So, and we're especially tuned into this kind of stuff right now, right? Because of this movement that's happening right now. Environmental and climate justice should never be far from our thoughts when we're thinking about how to manage our natural resources. So impoverished communities and communities of color are much more likely to live in polluted areas, have exposure to toxic substances, less likely to have access to clean air and clean water. There's a ton of really scary statistics that we could cite, but African Americans in particular are 3 times more likely to die from exposure to air pollution. African American children are 5 times more likely to die of lead poisoning. These impoverished communities and communities of colors are more likely to be near a hazardous waste site and more likely to be impacted by climate change. We're even seeing the impacts of coronavirus concentrated in these areas. And it's really important that we recognize that many or most of these impacts come from resource extraction and production. And most of those impacts, again, are for us, right? So these are the resources that we are consuming all the time that are creating downstream impacts that we don't necessarily have to deal with the impacts of, but someone does, and disproportionately to these other communities. And so how do we bring that into our understanding of how we manage forests, right? So bringing it back from that very human level to sort of the level that I work at, which is the level of forest. And so we need to ask ourselves, can forest management have a positive influence on forests? And can managing forests have a positive influence on the world? So how do we both manage forests in a way that's regenerative and that is incorporating how they actually grow and work, and is also at the same time using them as much as we can to promote a holistically better world that's better for both forests and for people? There's this idea, Aldo Leopold. If you haven't read Aldo Leopold, you should. He's this amazing thinker who wrote down thoughts in the 1940s that most people are still just barely getting a hold of. He had this idea of the land ethic, which probably most of you have heard that term. This is a quote from him. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community, so the human community, to include soils, waters, plants, animals, or collectively the land. The land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So it's this idea that we humans often place ourselves sort of outside of natural communities, but it's this idea that we can place ourselves inside of them and think about how to actually be in a community with them, in addition to being a part of our human communities. There's a really good book, great book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is largely about land ethics. And she talks about, we always think about land ownership as this bundle of rights. So we buy this piece of land and we own it, and these are the rights that we have to it. And these are the things we can do. We can mine it, we can log it, we can build a house on it. But no one ever thinks about this idea of a bundle of responsibilities. So at the same time that there are all these things that we can sort of do with it and take from it, are there also responsibilities that are incumbent upon us towards the land? So sort of with all those things in mind, I practice a type of forestry called ecological forest management, and it's in every way different from the logging or the forest management that you may think of when you think of logging or forest management. It's this idea that we want to manage forests like they manage themselves. We're managing them as complex systems, including but not limited to trees. We're not managing them like fields of corn, where the sole purpose of those of the trees is just to produce value for us, and recognizing them as sort of recognizing that the importance of all of these organisms and processes make these systems work, and managing them accordingly. And in many cases, what we're doing is we're actually looking to those old growth forests to say, how do forests naturally grow and develop? And then basing the way that we manage our Vermont's relatively young, relatively less diverse forests, and to make them actually more diverse and more like old growth forests. So in practice, what this means is that we're managing to create many different ages, sizes, and species of trees. We're leaving tons of dead wood on the ground. So when I see a dead tree on the ground, I'm excited about it because I know that it's this incredibly important part of all these ecosystem processes. And so instead of trying to clean everything up, we're leaving tons of dead wood and treetops on the ground. We're retaining, meaning not cutting, and we're also recruiting, trying to make more of big old legacy trees, because we recognize that these have incredible ecological importance. At the same time, we're also trying to create a landscape which is as diverse as it was prior to European settlement, which means creating small pockets of early successional habitat, creating other and supporting other unique conditions in the forest that may have landscape level importance or be underrepresented across our landscape and be really important for wildlife, and taking really, really stringent measures to protect sensitive and unusual features and stuff like the quality of our soils and the quality of our waters. And as I've gotten into this, I believe in forest management very strongly, and especially in ecological forest management. But as I think about the way that forest management can contribute to a better world, I really think that it can be radical. So when we think about environmental justice, one of the biggest drivers of environmental injustice is this idea of not in my backyard, right? So people who are wealthier, who are white, who are, have all of these different privileges, have the resources to say, actually, I don't want resource production in my backyard. And in so doing, displace it to communities who don't have the resources to stand up for themselves or to say, no, we don't want that here. And so rejecting that, I think, is really radical. Local resources also, consuming local resources means that we have control over where resources come from, rather than displacing them to places where there would be greater environmental and social impacts elsewhere in the country or in the world. Wood is a renewable resource, and actually a renewable resource, which is used, in many cases, sort of opposed to toxic non-renewable resources, right? So when we say, we're not going to harvest any trees, in many cases what it means is instead we're going to use plastic, right? Forest management can also contribute to these really interesting sort of small-scale economic factors on our land. So it can make it more affordable to own land, promoting economic equity, making it so you don't have to be rich to own land. These private landowners who own 80% of our landscape, they have to pay taxes on their land every year, and it's usually thousands of dollars. And the last thing we want is to make it so you have to be a wealthy person to own land. And so if they can offset some of their taxes and their management expenses through periodically doing a little harvesting, I think that that's a really exciting, good thing. And also, it can lower development pressure. So providing some economic output from forests can also mean that people don't feel like they have to sell their land to be developed, because there's another way that they can periodically earn a little income. How much time we got? 15 minutes. Okay. So there is a number of other factors that tie into all of this really important stuff. So I used to talk about climate change a lot. Now I talk about global change more often. So global change is climate change plus all the other stuff that we've done to our environment that also make it difficult for us to grow healthy ecosystems. So we've altered natural disturbance regimes. So with climate change, we're expecting natural disturbances of increased frequency, increased severity, different types of precipitation at different times, which has different impacts, stuff like that. We've introduced invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, which have massively impacted our forests. I'll talk about that a little bit later. We've converted and cut down and fragmented our forest into smaller and smaller pieces. We've polluted our forest and caused stuff like acid deposition, which has massive ecosystem-wide consequences and more. And so even as we look to old growth forests to sort of provide us with a template for how forests are supposed to grow and develop, it's really important to recognize that the forests of tomorrow are going to be different than those old growth forests. And so we have to manage for forests and other ecosystems which are adaptive, resilient, and able to cope with all of these other elements of global change, these drastic environmental changes that we expect in the future. And also, again, recognizing that climate impacts are not equally distributed. And so anything we can do to mitigate climate change, which will also involve mitigating all of these aspects of global change, is radical. So how do we do that? This is sort of a buzzword in forestry right now. It's really, really important. It's saying that the idea of forests being resilient is paramount to how we manage them. Resilient forests are just forests that are capable of being healthy, maintaining natural processes throughout great stress and change. So instead of saying, well, you know, a forest is only healthy if all the individual trees are healthy, we're saying forests are healthy if they have the structures in place to withstand this incredibly chaotic, unexpected elements of global change. So this is from a really cool publication. It's actually a workbook by Tony D'Amato, who's a professor at UVM, Paul Catanzaro, and Emily Huff, called Increasing Forest Resiliency for an Uncertain Future. They lay out these 4 goals. So goal number 1, keep forests as forests and keep them connected. So ensure connected, conserved forest cover, preferably on a range of environmentally diverse sites. What that means is keep forests from being converted to other uses, because once they're converted to other uses, they can't mitigate climate change anymore. Goal 2, reduce stressors, so limit the amount of stress that forests face. And what that means is doing our best to combat stuff like invasive exotic plants and diseases, which also ties into goal 3, reducing vulnerability, making forests more resilient by establishing complex structures and reducing disturbances. So basically what they're saying by saying establish forests with complex structures is they're basically saying create forests which are more like old growth forests, create forests with diverse different ages and species and sizes of trees, living and dead. That's really important. And then goal 4, provide refuge. So maintaining the maximum amount of plant and animal diversity over time. One of the ways that we can do this, there's this really sort of interesting newer idea in forestry of managing for forest carbon. Interestingly, so forests suck up a lot of carbon, suck up or quote unquote sequester a lot of carbon. But as they become less healthy, which they're likely to do if these elements of global change aren't mitigated, they will be able to do that less. So it's really important that we basically make them holistically healthy so they can suck up more carbon, but also sucking up more carbon has feedbacks into making them holistically healthy by mitigating the effects of climate change, we hope. How do we do that? Same story as increasing resilience. So we increase their diversity, both species diversity and structural diversity, increase their resilience, keeping them forested, leaving big trees, avoiding large-scale disturbances, leaving lots of dead wood in the forest, and protecting long-term forest health. So interestingly, there are trade-offs between managing for carbon and managing for ecologically healthy landscapes. So in most cases, just cutting no trees will keep the most carbon in the forest, but that doesn't mean that we are providing the qualitative benefits of like providing habitat for all the species that are stressed out on our landscape, or producing local renewable resources which have tie-ins to these global environmental and climate justice. And there's trade-offs between carbon management and producing local renewable resources. So it's this really interesting idea of, sort of not everything we can do can just be qualitatively for managing for forest carbon, because there's all this other stuff that is sort of, or I should say quantitatively for forest carbon, because there's all of these other qualitative elements like managing for wildlife and environmental justice, which are also really, really important. I might just shoot right past this slide here. This is a really just cool, another resource by Tony D'Amato, Paul Catanzaro, and others. This is just a cool resource from another publication that they did about managing for forest carbon that shows several other elements of the forest as they develop over time. So here in the center, we have the clock. This is the number of years from 0 to 500. This brown outer ring is the amount of carbon sequestered in the forest. So as a forest develops from, say, a field, more and more carbon is going to be sequestered in that system. Actually, a lot of it is sequestered in the soil. In Vermont, about 2/3 of that carbon is sequestered in our soils. But those forests, if they're not widely disturbed by any large-scale disturbance, will keep on sequestering more and more carbon throughout their life, or keep on storing more and more carbon, I should say. Sequestering carbon is a little bit different. So young forests in this sort of 30 through like 60-year-old age class, you can see by the fact that they're darker green, they're sucking up more carbon, but the amount of carbon that they can suck up or sequester declines over time. So this is an important thing to understand. Younger forests are sequestering more carbon, but older forests are actually storing more carbon. So the fact that young forests sequester more carbon was used by the timber industry to justify large clear cuts in many cases. So they're saying, well, we want to sequester more carbon, right? So we want to do these big clear cuts so we can grow these young forests. What they don't say is that older forests are storing more carbon. So there needs to be a balance between these two things. Talking about invasive specifically, so again, with a global context, and I'll bring it back to Vermont, along with habitat loss and climate change, we call biological invasions are a major threat to global diversity, biodiversity, I should say. Invasive organisms account for about half of all extinctions, of which the cause is known. According to the National Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by invasives. This is an example of it right here. It's called the brown tree snake, and introduced into Guam, has caused essentially all of the native forest bird species to go extinct. So 10 of them are extinct. The remaining 2 are considered functionally extinct in the wild. And so the impact of these invasives, especially invasive organisms, especially invasive animals, but also invasive plants, is extreme. In Vermont, invasive exotic plants is one of the biggest parts that we have to deal with. We also have a number of invasive insects, pests, and pathogens that affect our forest trees. But invasive exotic plants basically clog up our forests, displace our native species, and prevent this natural cycle that we talked about of disturbance, growth, regeneration from occurring. And in so doing, they decrease ecosystem diversity, resiliency, health, their ability to store carbon, their ability to provide wildlife habitat, their ability to provide clean air and clean water. And this is a problem that we expect to increase in severity as our climate changes. So this is one of those things where you really got to sort of like put your big boy pants on and be willing to do something that you don't want to do to address this problem. So dealing with these invasive plants at any scale, but especially at more than a couple of small plants, they're almost impossible to kill. So dealing with them at scale in many cases requires the use of herbicide. And so I'm like, everybody hates herbicide, right? We don't want herbicide on our food. We don't want herbicide in agriculture. But there are ways to apply herbicide in a really targeted and minimal way, which can actually make it so that we can address these plants in a meaningful way. And without doing that, we don't. And so a lot of people say, I don't want to use herbicide. And so what they, in effect, do is doom their forest to being completely overrun by these invasive plants, which are completely diminishing their capacity to function as forests. What I think is, in this context, really radical is saying, okay, I'm going to re-examine this idea that I have about this chemical herbicide and think about how we can actually use it as a restoration tool. I went from being someone who is completely like, no, I'm never going to use herbicide or do anything like that, to being really excited about the really minimal use of herbicide, because I understand that it is the way that we're going to protect our forests. And while it makes us uncomfortable, I think it's really, really important that we think about it. Another thing we need to think about is forest loss. So in many ways, forest loss is more of a dire threat than bad logging. So everybody's scared of bad logging, right? But forest loss is permanent. So when you convert a forest into a house site or a shopping mall or whatever, it's never going to sequester and store carbon. It's never going to provide wildlife habitat again. And so in this way, this is this sort of sinister thing, and everybody wants to live in a house like this person in this picture here. They wanted to live in a house with a view, so they punched this road all the way in through this property, all the way up here, so they could put their house on this ridgeline, and deeply fragmented this incredibly beautiful, intact core area of habitat. And they did it for a good reason, right? They wanted a beautiful view. But at the same time, it's sort of the death by 1,000 cuts on our landscape. So our forest gets split up by roads and by houses and by different types of development, residential and commercial development. And suddenly we don't have these big blocks of forest anymore. We have these tiny little pieces, and they actually function really differently. So what can we do about that? We can, one of the interesting things is advocating for denser development in our village and city centers. So in the areas that are already fragmented and affected, advocating for more dense development in those areas, hopefully, and then advocating for much less development in the areas that are not already fragmented or developed, means that we're going to protect those intact blocks of forest land. So it might require us, again, to live, to say, well, I don't want to live, I want to live at the end of a dirt road. I don't want to live in a place where there's more people, but having more people here means that we're protecting our natural resources elsewhere. If you live in most of the towns in Chittenden County, there's a local planning commission, conservation commission. They're always looking for members, and just by showing up to those and advocating for the protection of forests and forest blocks, you can make a huge difference. And the other thing we can do is to permanently conserve as much land as possible. So with a lot of this stuff, I think about it as sort of the qualitative and the quantitative. So qualitatively, how do we protect all of these individual aspects that make forests work? And how do we think about each individual component that's important to us about forests, and that each individual resource that forests produce? But there's also quality, right? There's the idea that these forests are these incredibly rich, abundant ecosystems, and how do we protect that function? And then at the same time, how do we do that in a way that also incorporates these ideas of forming more just, more equitable societies? And this idea of sort of taking cues from the forest in terms of making these really complex, intergenerational, dynamic, equitable worlds, right? Both in terms of ecologically and socially. And so I think that that's a really important idea. And to close, I'll just say that this other quote from Aldo Leopold here, that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and the beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And so I would say that that's true both for our forests and for our human communities. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I would love to take any questions if you have any.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, you can hit that raise your hand button. Getting an echo from somebody. You can hit that raise your hand button, or you can type it into the chat.
So one thing I'll say, and I'm still trying to figure out, like, a lot of this is a work in progress, right? And I'm still trying to figure out a lot of these things, but I often say that I'm the guy who often I feel like I'm just telling people to do stuff they don't want to do all the time, right? Like, I'm telling them, maybe there's ways that we can cut trees that can be okay, and maybe we should be like using herbicide to control invasive plants. And another serious thing that we need to think about is controlling our deer population, which is like a major threat to biodiversity. If you go anywhere south of us, it's like one of the major issues they deal with, and we now know that deer are overpopulated in Vermont, and becoming more so. it's just a really funny thing. But a lot of these things, I think what makes these ideas to me radical is this idea that it requires us to go beyond, we have an idea about what's right and wrong and how to protect our forests, and requires us to go beyond that and to sort of engage with the nuances of these things and understand that, sort of the answers might be different than we expect, I guess. And just engaging with them, I think, is one of the most radical things we can do.
All right, we do have a question in the chat. Jonathan asks, have you met any resistance to this idea of radical forestry by your counterparts in forestry in the state of Vermont or New England at large?
Yeah, I meet resistance all the time. I mean, I think that, in the sort of, a lot of foresters in Vermont are doing forestry that's like this. They're doing ecological forest management anyway. So it's not like I thought of this and I'm the only one that's doing it. But in sort of the forestry establishment, the idea is that forests are a resource, and the extent of their value to us is the extent is the resources that they provide. So, all of this stuff, they would think of this as like, the idea that, that I would have the gall to like want to manage forests based on how forests work doesn't make any sense. They want to manage forests as a crop, and they want to manage them in these plantations where they grow trees really fast, and then they harvest them by clear cutting, and then, spray herbicide from planes. And that's still how most of the timber that we consume is produced. So in Maine, in the American Southeast, to great extent, and in the American Northwest with Douglas fir, that's how most of our wood is grown. And so that's just really important to know. And so, yeah, mostly from what I would call like older school foresters, they just have a completely different way of thinking about the forest. One of the things that they always, or the sort of mindsets that they have, is just the idea that, like, no matter what we do, everything will just be okay. That, we can just continue to exploit the forest and it will just be fine. There's nothing we can do to hurt it. And it's just not true. And it's empirically not true. We know from the research that treating forests like that has major implications for their health. And I get also resistance, right, from the other side where, among people who are, think of themselves as like really, really progressive, and they are, people who would, want to protect forests by never managing them and think that humans have absolutely no role in them. And then they see me out here advocating for cutting trees. I sort of like am like at odds with both of those different sides of this kind of debate. And also I get a lot of resistance about the herbicide thing. I really think and this is, herbicide is really tough because we know that it's bad. And we've been told all our lives, and and especially in a place like Chittenden County, Vermont, we try and avoid it at every turn. But working with these invasives, this is the way that we're going to get control of this issue. And even if it's uncomfortable for us, it's worth it. And that's why pretty much every conservation organization that's in the business of managing invasive species uses herbicide and recommends it, from the Nature Conservancy to Vermont Land Trust to Audubon Vermont to Vermont Fish and Wildlife. This is, I see us as being sort of like beyond progressive, because we're recognizing how big of a problem this is, and we're actually willing to do what's necessary to get the job done, even if it means sort of like engaging with this really scary or uncomfortable act of using herbicide. And it's not that we think that herbicide's okay, or that we're like totally blind to the fact that it can be misused. I think it's misused in almost every context. But it can be used as a tool to support things that we really care about. So yeah, so there's some resistance to various parts of it.
Yeah. We have another question in the chat from Catherine, who asks, what is the long-term effect of forest fires on the health of forests?
Yeah, so I actually don't know as much about that as my counterparts out west would, just because fires are not as much a part of our ecosystems here as they are out west. But I do know, actually, interestingly, that similar to, so I talked about, making our forests more like old growth forests and making them more complex and diverse. And instead of being even age, so all trees are about the same size and age, which almost all of our forests are, because almost all of them were fields, less than 100 years ago. Managing our forests to be different sizes and ages of trees also sort of buffers us from these large-scale disturbance events. So like in Vermont, if you have a pine plantation, let's say, or an old field that regenerated into a stand of pine and they're all the same size and they're all the same age, that stand is very vulnerable to like a big wind storm. It takes out the canopy, it takes out all the canopy trees all at once, and suddenly you're back to square one, right? And that's a very destabilizing thing for a forest. The same is true for forest fires out west. So instead of managing these plantations like they have out west, managing for different species of trees, different sizes and ages of trees has positive implications for lowering the severity of forest fires. Because these really, really intense forest fires, some forest fires on that landscape are normal. The intensity of the forest fires we have now are like really abnormal, and they're a result of decades of fire suppression, and then also forests which again are even aged. And so you have forests that are all the same thing, growing in all the same way. They're very susceptible to these really escalating high intensity fires. And what happens when there's a fire, the same thing actually that happens when there's a big clear cut or when there's a big blowdown event, you are very susceptible to invasive exotic species. You lose a lot of that soil carbon. So remember I said most of the carbon in a forest is stored in the soil. When there's a big disturbance, all of that microbial life and the microorganisms in the soil get like jacked up on the heat and the light and the moisture and the nutrient availability, and they digest all that carbon really quickly, and so throw it back up into the air as carbon dioxide very quickly. There's a whole lot of, and then also what I would say is that also nutrients are flushed out of that system. So suddenly there's no plants or trees to suck up water and the nutrients that are dissolved in that water, like calcium and magnesium and potassium and sulfur. And so all those things get flushed out of the system, and the forest as a system is actually degraded.
Looks like we have a hand raise from Sarah. So Sarah, if you'd like to unmute yourself to ask your question and then remute yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, this is Sarah. And my question is, hi, Ethan. If a forest is truly old growth, does it require management? Or like, do you at some point, I hear you saying that we should be kind of emulating trying to get to a state of old growth. Is there a point when you get there and it's kind of like taking care of itself and you don't manage it anymore? Or do you feel like humans always have a role to manage?
So I definitely think that, so I want to encourage diversity across the landscape of all different types of forests. So that also means like some forests which are unmanaged, I think is really, really important. There's this amazing resource called Vermont Conservation Design, which was developed by the Vermont Land Trust and Vermont Fish and Wildlife. It was basically about prioritizing which land to conserve, but it also talks about having an ecologically functional landscape. So trying to sort of restore some of the balance of young forest and old forest. And so they set a goal of 9% of our forests, which I think is 6.7% of our landscape as just old unmanaged forest. And I think that that's beautiful. I think that that's a great thing. I think that, again, some people in sort of the forestry establishment are very threatened with the idea of unmanaged forests, but they're always, in wanting to have diversity across our landscape, there are always going to be things that completely unmanaged forests can provide that forests that are managed in any way probably cannot provide. And then, so I think that's really, I don't think forests in general necessarily like need our intervention. I just think that there's opportunities for us to intervene in ways to address the issues that we've created, I guess, and to address like the resource realities, like people consuming all this stuff coming from all these really scary places. And I think that forests could be a really cool place for them to come from, and that we could do it in a way that is making them more like old growth forests. But like, So I think that it's sort of complicated, but the way I'm thinking about it and talking about it right now, but I think there should be unmanaged forests. I think that there should be a lot of forests that we're managing continuously, which we're managing with this ecological approach. And with a lot of even with old growth forests, I think that there's the possibility that humans could intervene in doing stuff like creating addressing problems that we've created, especially like with invasive exotic species. So like with old growth forests, I would say that like the minimum level of responsible management is no management plus invasive species management, because in lieu of invasive species management, forests can't or their ability to manage themselves will be compromised. So that's what I would say. I would say that, you know, they don't need us to do that, but that's a way that we can help them out. That is a way we can actually be positive or act sort of holistically, positively, symbiotically with them.
Great. We have another question from the chat. We actually have two from Jane, who asks, are you still meeting with landowners and viewing their forests during the pandemic? And what do you have to say about the impact of invasive earthworms on forest ecology?
Hey, Jane. I'm doing it a little bit. We weren't doing any site visits for like 3 months. And I was just working from home and doing like virtual, I call myself the virtual forester because I just do all these virtual workshops. And then I was about to start at the beginning of this month, and then I got hurt working in the woods. But I'm starting next month, I'm starting to do visits again. And we're just going to do them at distance with masks on, because we just got to get back out in the woods again. And the woods is probably like the safest place you could be also during this time. So yeah, I am starting to do that. Earthworms, another one of these invasive organisms that's like really scary. So one of the things most people don't know is that we don't have any native earthworms in Vermont. All of the earthworms we have are European or Asian. And one, you know, everybody's like, well, we love earthworms, right? Because they cycle nutrients quickly and they aerate our soils. And in an agricultural context, they're really, really helpful. In a forest context, they actually do that too much. So they decompose the leaf litter, especially, too quickly. And the result of that is that this leaf litter supports the growth of like a lot of different tree seedlings and also arthropods and insects and other forms of life that are really important to forest growth and development. Probably the most charismatic species that cannot grow in areas that are deeply infested by earthworms, just because there's none of that decomposing leaf litter, the duff, that layer at the top of the soil, is sugar maple. So if you go to Shelburne Farm, which has a really, really serious invasive earthworm infestation, I think they're mostly European earthworms, night crawlers, imported on plants and through people's fishing stuff. They have basically, if you go there in July, there's no leaves on the ground. It's bare dirt. And every year they get this really beautiful flush of sugar maple seedlings in the understory of the forest, and then they all dry out and die. So that's a nut that we have not figured out how to crack at all. And now we've got this Asian one called the crazy snake worm. That's really scary. But treating them is something that we haven't figured out yet. But it's definitely an impact. One way, if you don't have earthworms already, one way to avoid introducing them is to avoid throwing out like pots of soil that may have earthworms in them from like a nursery plant or something into the woods. And also, if you're going to plant trees, try to get bare rootstock, because then you're not bringing in, you know, like a big root ball which has a bunch of worms. I bought a peach tree on my property, and someone else bought it for me, and so instead of bare root, they bought it with a root ball, and I started tearing out that root ball, and it was just full of worms. And so it's really, really, if they're not there already, it's really, really important that we manage them. It also or that we avoid introducing them. It's also really important to recognize the threat of earthworms from a water quality perspective. So they've done studies also at Shelburne Farms and found that the nutrient runoff, so those soil particles that are mobilized because there's none of that decomposing leaf litter on top of them, when the rain hits them, it dislodges those soil particles, and attached to them is like phosphorus and stuff like that, which pollutes the lake. And the nutrient runoff from their forests actually exceeds the nutrient runoff from their dairy operation in terms of the nutrients that they're contributing into their waterways. So it's pretty serious, but we have absolutely no idea of how to deal with it.
Great. Sarah, you still have your hand up. I'm just curious if you have another question, or if not, no. Okay, great. So we do have a question from Jonathan in the chat. Would you consider humans a keystone species? For instance, if we had way more people managing the forests through a massive green jobs program, could we then manage the invasive species with less and less herbicides and more individual and community involvement?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, Jonathan, I wrote an article. I write this monthly column in a bunch of community newspapers in the county. And last month, I wrote an article about keystone species. And that was sort of my wrap up, is this idea that a keystone species, right, is a species that disproportionately affects its environment in a positive way, in a way that's actually providing opportunities for all kinds of different organisms of all different types. And so I think that especially with the the things we've done to affect our forests by from clearing them, and in so doing creating forests which are simpler and younger than forests were likely to be prior to European settlement, and all these other invasive species and climate change, and that there is an opportunity, I believe, that we could be something that could be called a keystone species. And how we would do that is by engaging with our forests instead of just destroying them and just using them, to actually think about ourselves as like in some sort of a partnership with them, where we're actually really trying to create something that is mutually beneficial, and recognizing the role, the negative role that we played in forests. And to your point about invasive species, you're totally right. So we wouldn't have to use herbicide if we had like massive landscape-wide effort to control invasive plants. We could totally do it. But and I guess my recommendation of using herbicide in the case of invasive species is sort of a pragmatic one, because in most cases this is like an individual person trying to get a hold of this population and not having all the time in the world to cut that buckthorn plant 2 times a year for the next 10 years, which is what it's going to take to kill it. But if we had like a massive green jobs program, and we had people, crews of hundreds of people going across the landscape and killing invasive plants, I think our need for herbicides would be tremendously reduced. And that would be really cool in a bunch of different ways. But the other thing is recognizing that forests are, again, providing all of these incredible benefits. They're providing us literally with the means to physically live here. They're literally providing the air we breathe and the water that we drink, and providing habitat for the pollinators of our agricultural crops. And so recognizing the value of forests and the threat of these invasive plants, if we were to put a dollar value on that, you would think that some sort of massive landscape-wide effort to deal with that would be warranted. We just haven't figured out how to correctly value the threat of those invasive plants.
All right, excellent. I did have a question in the chat for me, actually. It was about releasing the recording. So yes, this has been recorded, and we will work on releasing that to you guys, most likely in an email sometime next week. We're also going to look into putting it up on our website and our social media platforms, so we will have the opportunity to view this again. A few minutes left for any last final questions, and then if not, we can all say thank you to Ethan and say goodnight, but I'll see if there's any other questions that are coming out. Nope, doesn't look like it. All right, great. Well, thank you, Ethan, so much. Thank you to everybody who participated. I hope you all enjoyed it. I will also be emailing out rather shortly. I think at 9, I have the email scheduled for a survey, so you can tell me what your thoughts were about this program. This is our first webinar, so we're very excited to have Ethan along for that. And yeah, if you just need to hang up, you can hit that little hang up button. And otherwise, thank you all so much for coming.
Let me just say, I'm going to put my email here in the chat. And if you guys have any questions about this, or if you want to get on my email list for different events that I'm doing in the future, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to continue any of these conversations with you all.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.